Hello, I am here with a Christmas special update. It's nothing to do with Christmas. I am back discussing re-identification of Tudor portraits as somehow being considered good at re-identification of portraits, even though I'm really not. But we're looking at recent rumbles surrounding this portrait, painted by Michel Sittow in the early 16th century, roughly 1500 to 1515. Traditionally, this portrait has been identified as being one of Catherine of Aragon during her widowhood and before her eventual remarriage to Henry VIII. The painting being roughly painted around 1505. However, this identification has been called into question, with some saying it actually dates to 1514 and was a betrothal portrait of the Princess Mary Tudor, youngest sister of Henry VIII and eventual Queen of France and Duchess of Suffolk. Yes, there were court painters who were not Hans Holbein the Younger. Quelle surprise! Sittow was an Estonian painter who went unidentified until the early 20th century. In 1914, art historian Max J. Friedlander linked Master Michel, court painter of Elizabeth of Castile, to the creator of a diptych from Burgos depicting Virgin and Child on one side and a Knight of the Order of Calatrava on the other. Different art scholars tracked Master Michel's career across Spain, Denmark and the Netherlands until Paul Johannesson definitively linked Master Michel as being Michel Sittow from Rival. We have a fairly good idea of his life and his career tracked through legal records, guild records, inventories across various European countries and his illustrious patrons, which included Isabella of Castile, Christian II of Denmark and Archduchess Margaret of Austria. But we don't actually have many surviving examples of his work despite his obvious skills as a portraitist. They're very vivid, delicate and truly manage to capture an essence of the sitter, a skill normally associated with Italian or Flemish Renaissance art, not necessarily Estonia, which is interesting in itself. Sittow's connections to the Spanish court and the Habsburg dynasty are most likely what led to the identification of this portrait as being a Catherine of Aragon in 1915. Friedlander, who was an expert in Dutch and Northern Renaissance painting, had been responsible for reintroducing the world to Sittow's works, and it only made sense for him to demonstrate examples of Sittow's work by trying to match inventory known paintings to surviving contemporary paintings. He argued that this painting had to be Catherine because the neckline of the bodice features a border of cockle shells centred with a tiny C. Cockle shells are the symbol of St. James, patron saint of Spain. The heavy gold necklace has pearls and enamel roses with the initial K. Roses are the symbol of the Tudor dynasty and K for Catherine. Catherine was fair-skinned and a redhead like the sitter depicted. Dr. Emma Carroll Maron stated she believes Catherine is more likely to be the sitter than any others, given that she apparently operated as an artistic agent for Henry VII. In 1505, Catherine spoke to the Spanish ambassador that Sittow was an incredible portraitist, although she did already have previous knowledge of him from her mother's court. It has been previously suggested that Sittow came to London for a time from 1503 to 1505, but more recent evidence suggests that he didn't come to England at this time. He more likely came into contact with Catherine at this time through his work for her mother until 1502, his work for her brother-in-law in 1505 and 1506, and then on to Denmark, Austria and Spain again over 1514 and 1515 until returning to his homeland of Estonia in 1516 or 1517. The evidence suggests that it is not 1505 that Sittow came to work with the English court, but rather 1514. He is recorded as painting in the English court around this time, according to Paul G. Matthews in Henry VIII's favourite sister, Michel Sittow's Portrait of a Lady in Vienna. Elizabeth Cleland, co-curator of the Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England, argues that the 1514 date would point to Princess Mary being the sitter rather than Catherine. If we accept the attributed date and artist, it is much more likely to be Mary than Catherine, who would have been a married mum in her 30s at this point, and the jewellery, even with its K, matches pieces Mary was given by none other than her erstwhile suitor, the Habsburg Prince Charles, Carolus, which marriage negotiations, for him, provide the more likely context for the creation of this lovely work. It has been argued that the woman in the painting is too young to be 30. Yes, 30. Catherine was only 30, hardly an aged hag, and that the physical features of the portrait do not match those we know that Catherine had. Her other portraits show her as stout, with small eyes and a tightly held mouth. Princess Mary, youngest sister of Henry VIII, was betrothed to Habsburg Prince Charles, later become King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, in 1506. In 1508, Mary was presented with a gift from Charles, a large piece of jewellery with a K garnished with diamonds, pearls, and an inscription praising Mary's holy namesake. It has been suggested that this painting is a demonstration of that betrothal, featuring Mary and her engagement necklace. Mary has been mentioned as having blue eyes and golden red hair, similar to her brother, although other images at the time display her as being dark-haired. There's also the slight spanner in the works regarding the date. The given dates are consistent in saying 1514 is the date when Sittow painted the possible portrait of Princess Mary. The painter has made a good likeness of Mary is specifically mentioned in dispatches by the Habsburg envoy in 1514, but, and it's a pretty big but, Charles and Mary's betrothal was over by that point. Nada, gone, dismissed. It ended in 1513, an entire year before this portrait might have been painted. In fact, the English court was elbow deep in negotiations for Mary to marry the King of France by the time that this portrait might have been painted. And she did marry him in 1514. It is clear that a portrait of Princess Mary Tudor was made. It is evidenced in comments made, letters, inventories of the Archduchess Margaret of Austria. Whether this portrait is of Mary seems a little bit up in the air. The arguments made for either Mary or Catherine are ambiguous, as they can both be argued for either way, and we have very little evidence that Sittow ever actually made it to England. The traditional dates in 1505 are now not accepted, and the evidence he was here in 1514 is based on an idea that he might have nipped to London while travelling to Copenhagen. There's a lot of maybes, a lot of perhapses, a whole lot of nothing to actually show that he ever came to England and ever painted a portrait. Whoever the sitter of this frankly beautiful portrait is, they do have a clear link with Spain. The symbol of St. James, the cockle shells around the bodice, shows that. The fashion is also a key to establishing when this painting was completed. The sitter has a gown with a tight-fitting bodice, a low square neckline and a close-fitting headdress. The style is more Flemish and Burgundian than English, and the style of headdress and the tailoring and cut of the dress shows this portrait really can't come from 1505. It much more closely matches the styles of the 1510s. With that said, it's not likely to have been painted much later than the early 1520s at a stretch. Spanish-style variations of dress were popular in the first decade of Henry VIII's reign. Court wardrobe records that gowns and outfits were commonly distributed as gifts, but that Spanish variants were common attire. The headdress is not especially known to the English court. English headdresses had a stiffened bonnet, generally covered with a longer frontlet that gradually transitioned to what we know as a traditional gable hood. The sitter wears a Flemish-style headpiece that marks a clear continental style that's not likely to be worn at English court. If you look at the records, they mention French, they mention Milanese, they mention English, but not Flemish-style headdresses. What also often goes unmentioned when discussing the nature of identifying the sitter of this portrait is the paintings that go along with this one. Sittow painted 2 other portraits with this sitter, religious pieces showcasing the Virgin Mary in motherhood and Mary Magdalene. These would be strange depictions for a teenage wannabe bride to be represented as a loving, tender mother and penitent bride of Christ unmatched in devotion. Those attributes might better fit an older woman, such as Catherine, rather than a teenager who is unmarried and doesn't have any children. It's also just it's a very serious picture. It's very somber. It's beautiful, but it doesn't scream happy engagement. It's a very mature and dignified work that would perhaps signify an older sitter befitting of such treatment. For me, I'm more personally inclined to believe in the traditional identification of this sitter as Catherine. Call it nostalgia, but the evidence for it being Princess Mary is based on a betrothal that was already over, and the idea that this couldn't possibly be a 30-year-old woman, which as a currently 30-year-old woman, I took personal offence at that. Or perhaps I will take door number 3. The basis for the identification of either being Catherine of Aragon or Princess Mary Tudor rests on very slim evidence, coming down to a letter K, a rose, and a monogram that may or may not be the letter C. It's not actually very clear. Observation on Michel Sittow posits that this may in fact be a portrait of a completely unrelated woman. We only came about any sort of royal connection because of an art historian in 1915 who was looking for examples of Sittow's work. It's a bit of confirmation bias there. For centuries, this was just a picture of an anonymous woman, never connected to any royal family, whether in England or on the continent. Maybe this is the face of a completely different woman entirely, one Sittow either new in Spain or in Habsburg-controlled lands, and it's only our desire to link her with someone well known that's created evidence of royal connections. We are looking for her to be royalty and then creating the evidence from that. We would like her to have a name simply because it's better to imagine this woman as being someone rather than no one. Anyway, I'm back on talking about portraits, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you like, you share, you subscribe, you do a little dance, you have a great day. See ya.